Hello, Mhotep, and welcome to this latest transmission of my Egyptian Magic podcast. I'm Mog Morgan, companion of Seth and Knight of Shambhala. I've been getting feedback on some of the previous transmissions and podcasts, so keep that coming. That's kind of quite useful to me to know how it's going. So you can comment on the YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, usual things. And do check out my several books on Egyptian magic and its connections, which are heavily illustrated, as I say, and often the images and sources that I talk about are kind of dealt with in a more user-friendly way there as well. So do check out that. So last time I talked a little bit about Crowley and stuff. I'll probably have to return to that because maybe I tried to cover too much. But someone did, one of the feedbacks was that they obviously were familiar with the books. They quite liked something that I'd used to open the, like an opening rite really, like an Egyptian equivalent of a ritual that's well known within the Western Hermetic tradition, which is, where they use this pentagram rite. I kind of use Egyptian rites which are probably the origin of these things. So there's a thing that's called the Abidos Arrangement. I haven't actually used it in the podcast, but maybe on other things I've used it. Anyway, they said they quite like that. So I thought I'd share that with you now, which is what I mean by the Abidos Arrangement is: before me in the east Nephthys, behind me in the west Isis, on my right hand in the south is Set, on my left hand in the north is Horus, for above me shines the body of Nut, and below me extends the ground of Geb the earth god, and in the centre abideth the great hidden god. So that's what I call the Abidos Arrangement, which over the course of this season and maybe more we'll be exploring the mysteries of Abidos, of course, and whatever. That invocation, which say is in the pentagram rite, which is, I think it starts Aso, Malko, Figavura and all that sort of stuff. It's got the same sort of rhythm, I think, but I tend to use the kind of Egyptian stuff. There's a papyrus. There is an ancient papyrus called Papyrus Salt, which has a diagram of what it calls the House of Life, which is it's actually a place of study and whatever, but it's obviously got a magical connotation, and in fact it's got a very interesting history, which we'll probably have to go into a few times. It'll crop up again, so it's a good idea to introduce that. But the basic idea of a 4-square room with different Egyptian gods or netures at the quarters, at the 4 quarters, above, below, and in the centre. And this arrangement recurs a lot in Egyptian magic, and in religion really, and in temple design and all the rest. So I thought I'd share that with you. But today I wanted to talk a little bit more about the god Thoth, or Jehuti. I say a little bit more because I did something for someone else's podcast, which we also talked about Thoth at her request, and as so often is the case when people ask you what they want you to kind of talk about, it reminds you that it is kind of it's important, I don't know which came first, in the sense that we're actually, in my reckoning, we're in the month of devoted to the god Thoth, who is obviously an incredibly important deity within the Egyptian tradition. This is not uncontested, but as I've said many times, if you're going to work a ritual year within the reconstructed Egyptian tradition, then you're going to have to make certain decisions about how you pace things and what each month signifies. And in various books, including my book, The Ritual Year in Ancient Egypt, I set out my reasoning for taking the basic idea that every month within the Egyptian tradition anyway was named after a particular god or goddess. So that gives you a natural cycle. It's not as simple as that, because obviously as time went on, things got amended and they got out of place in a way. They were moved around, or their names were lost and changed because of other reasons. So it's quite a complicated thing. But one way or another, I hit upon the idea. You see, the first month in the Egyptian cycle, if you like, after their new year, in their new year, is devoted to the god Thoth or Jehuti. And that's certainly the oldest arrangement, was that. But again, as we all see, one of the important things to understand about Egyptian culture is you've got the two major famous cults, the cult of the sun and the cult of the mysteries of Osiris. But you might add to that a third cult, which a very popular cult that existed before them in a way, which is the most ancient strata, which would be the cult of the moon. And that's where there are several different lunar deities within the Egyptian tradition, Thoth being the foremost of those. So Thoth would be the first month of the year. I suggest in the book as well that if you're following a lunar calendar, and this is actually quite a complicated business to follow a lunar calendar in the old way. Obviously, the Egyptians in most of the thousands of years of their history that we know about didn't follow the lunar calendar. They kind of cut themselves off from it. They reformed it and moved to this more familiar festival year that people often try and kind of make sense of. But I suppose the idea is I find it certainly from a magical point of view and from a philosophical point of view interesting to go back to the original state of things, because the traces of that persist within Egyptian culture, especially within the bits that interest us in terms of magic and whatever. So if you're running a lunar calendar, people will say, well, a lunar calendar, because the cycle of the moon is a little bit irregular, sooner or later it's going to get out of sync with the seasons. This is kind of on the principle that any calendar, the gods and goddesses within it are going to have some sort of relevance to the time of year in which that month occurs, to the seasons and all the rest. But to preserve that arrangement with a lunar calendar, you have to do a certain amount of calculation, and this has obviously been very important for human history, this process of constructing a lunar calendar through observation that becomes regular and has certain corrections made to it to make it save the phenomena, to make it fit with the phenomena. And Thoth, being the nature of the god he is, connected with things like knowledge and magic and calculation and astronomy and all the rest is very. It all makes sense in a way that he would be the first deity within the year, because in a sense he represents the entire year in terms of the calculations that has to be made. It's all down to him in one way or another, and this shows you quite why he is so important within their tradition. The other suggestion I make, so Thoth is either the first month of the year, but if you're running a true lunar calendar and you have to put in an extra month, there's a possibility every 3 years usually. every 2 to 3 years an extra month has to be added to get everything back into focus, as it were, then it could be that the month named after Thoth is actually this magical month, if you like, this extra liminal month that has to be inserted to keep everything running correctly, and that would also fit with the kind of mythology and Thoth. So that's what I do. I use the name Thoth for this extra month that only occurs every 2 to 3 years. So it's very, very special. Also, I do two things. I say I'm companion of Seth, so I'm kind of my kind of cultic affiliation is to the god Seth, but I'm kind of aware as well of the broader picture of the whole cycle of Egyptian ritual year, and it would also be that different cycles would be celebrated in different places in Egypt according to which god you thought was the most important. So one suggestion is that another name for the first month of the year is Tek, which means the cup. And there's an idea that in certain places, that people who are kind of very devoted to the god Set would, if that was the case, the first month of the year would be devoted to their primary deity. So that's one possibility that I put in the book. So sorry, but that sounds complicated. If you're personally are not into the god Set, you're following one of the other deities, then again you use the month Thoth as the primary first month. That's a possibility. Anyway, all this is set out in the book. So one way or another, I'm kind of alerting you to the fact that Thoth is an incredibly important supernatural god within the tradition, and we're in a celebration of his month. We're halfway through it. In fact, we've just had the full moon, and in fact, as I speak, it's a special day within even the Thoth tradition, which is not fully recognised, which is to do with the 18th day of the lunar cycle, 18th day since the new moon, which is a rather odd day, but we won't go into why that number, interesting number. But whatever, this particular day was a very special one as well for the people within Egypt. They celebrated a special festival for Thoth called Wag, which involved basically thinking about your ancestors, and primarily thinking about their tombs and graves, if such things exist, perhaps lighting a candle for them, or a lamp in the Egyptian tradition, or if you're able to visit in the tomb. The tombs would be, obviously there's a sealed bit which has got the sarcophagus and the mummy, if it's in that tradition, it's kind of in there, and all the kind of magical objects and the whole assemblies. But there's always a kind of antechamber, which is equally important, outside of the kind of thing where the living can gather to celebrate their relatives, to kind of meet them in a way, or certainly and the primary form that takes, as with a lot of Egyptian ritual stuff, is cleaning the place up. It's kind of common sense, really, that cleaning, the brushing and cleaning and putting things in order and changing the perishables, might be the linen and the decoration which exists within the tomb, is a kind of very human thing to do. Maybe leaving food offerings, maybe even sharing a meal, eating a meal there with the ancestors, and in some way they participate in that. So this was done on this day. It's very connected with this month, and I suppose you would say as well, it kind of fits with the nature of the god Thoth as well, who in origin is a very, very ancient entity. one of the oldest, certainly seems to be around with Taurus and Set, and who are also important gods who are connected with the myth of Thoth. So a very, very ancient entity, and probably originally something to do with the funeral, but not necessarily the very, very elaborate funeral, but we're talking about archaic burial, really, really long time ago. This is Thoth in his ibis form. It's often the bird or avian avatars or versions of Egyptian gods and goddesses who are most connected with funeral rites. Sometimes because maybe people notice the presence of birds at funerals. Obviously vultures are one obvious example of that, but other birds as well. And this association of birds which have this migration, there's a kind of natural way of fitting that with the cycle of the soul, the transmigration, if you like, the movement between different realms. Naturally it lends itself to the idea of Thoth. Or of birds, rather. As I say, the Isis and Nephthys, two important goddesses, also have these important avian avatars, known as the two kites. And probably in origin they were two bird entities, very, again, an extremely old idea, who, perhaps because of the noise they make, is an idea that the wailing noises that people make during these things are kind of beyond language in a way. They are kind of a sort of natural, expressive language. This is probably how they started out, as this kind of wailing sound that people liken to certain birds and all the rest. So that's a little bit more about Thoth. Thoth has all incredible functions, right? In terms of, if you're interested in magic, the more you talk about it, you can see why people found this such a kind of important concept, really, or deity to connect with. I mean, coming right up to the modern age, that Aleister Crowley created, one of the most popular things he did was the creation of this tarot deck, and he took an idea that other people in the tarot tradition had used, and they called it the Book of Thoth. He would have known, I guess, that the Book of Thoth, well, Thoth is primarily connected with the alphabet and with writing. So the idea of a book written by Thoth, which is not just any book, this is the kind of ultimate magical book. And in a sense, that's what the tarot is. The tarot kind of continues that tradition, really. So it's kind of quite clever of Crowley to have called it the Book of Thoth. I think you have to admit that because of this tradition that the tarot deck is a book. It's not just a collection of pictures. It is a collection of images, but of course that is the origin of writing, is these images. That's what a hieroglyph is. So you could say it's a collection of hieroglyphs in a certain sequence, used by magicians, according to some traditions in the modern world, to communicate with each other outside of their normal language. It is the language. It speaks the language of magic universally, and it does that because it uses images primarily, and colours and symbols, rather than much more sort of narrow language ideas. And of course that is the quintessential Egyptian idea of magic and connected with Thoth. And Thoth is one of the important entities of magic. In fact, anything that Thoth says, anything that Thoth will says, any utterance, anything that's written down with an inverted commas around it in the sense of saying he said that, is considered to be a magical spell anyway. Primarily because in terms of the creation of the languages themselves, this process is usually said that the god Ptah, in fact, created the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the hieroglyphic signs, or formed them in some way. But it's the god Thoth who kind of writes them down. And he does a bit more of that as well. I was explaining that there are kind of 600 or more of these images that developed over the years from a basic set of images, really, that a sort of alphabet of desire that was created in the very, very ancient world to express people's emotions and thoughts, and primarily with their magic. It's created as a magical tool, this set of images, but as I say, 600 of them, you would expect, in terms of the actual sounds that we make, that there'd be an awful lot of overlap between the different signs, and that 600 is rather an unnecessary number of signs. And sure enough, when Thoth writes these things down, he simplifies things. He's credited with constructing of taking the soul of the alphabet, in a way, of recognizing the soul of the alphabet, the essence of it, and putting this together in 30 basic signs that through which you can express any idea. And 30 would be the number of days in the lunar cycle from an Egyptian perspective. They had 30 days in their cycle in the original stuff. So you have one hieroglyph for each day of the lunar sequence. And this made life easier as well, a lot easier for people in Egyptian culture who had to kind of write things down, right? A culture such as ancient Egypt, in some ways the scribe, the person who could write things down, there are probably more of them. They look like priests, but they're not actually priests. They're scribes. They're the bureaucrats, if you like. There are armies of these educated, literate people, because they're the people who keep the society going, right? They make the records, the keeping of the records, because so many exchanges within Egyptian culture are based on credit, in a way. People think, look, you got paid in wheat and beer and all this sort of stuff, but it's difficult to believe that people kind of came away from the end of their work at the end of the week and were given this great sack of wheat and a barrel of beer or whatever. That more likely that this was kind of centralized, and that there was some sort of written record made of the work that you did and your entitlement, and you could go to a kind of central bank or credit exchange, and you're talking about credit, really. It's talking about old credit, and draw out, and it would entitle you to, take some of your sources that you've earned from the stores, or exchange them with other people for other things that are not on the list, the vegetables or the fish or whatever, or just buy a drink in the evening or whatever, these sort of things that you might have to do. So the scribe is the person who keeps the system running, and no surprise then that Thoth is the kind of patron of all scribes. In the book, I think I give I give a couple of some liturgy, and I give the standard. I give several different standard prayers of Thoth, including the standard conjuration of Thoth, but I also give the prayer of the scribe, someone who's kind of just a scribe whose patron is Thoth. And it's possible from reading this that the scribe may have been tattooed or branded even with a special mark to show that they were part of this particular sect, if you like, of scribes, that they were a kind of verified scribe. So that's a kind of another interesting idea as well, connected with Thoth. It says, "Come to me, Thoth, august Ibis, desired god of Hermopolis." And it says, "Make me skillful in my profession, the best of all occupations." The respected scribe becomes great, and there are many that you have helped who now are amongst the best. And it goes on like that. So this is the scribe's prayer, if you like, which is dedicated to their patron deity, which is Thoth. So Thoth has that kind of, I'm not saying it's mundane, it's part of the stuff that keeps things going. And he also has this kind of connection with magic and with words and the development of things. And you can see that continuation of the god Thoth in something called in later times, or certainly the thing that bridges it, because the bridge between us and this tradition for a long time was a thing called the Corpus Hermetica, or just the Hermetica, if you like. Hermes being the Greek name of Thoth, and which for a long time, obviously this set of dialogues and pieces of wisdom that has survived from the ancient world is supposedly written by Hermes Trismegistos, the thrice great Hermes, and there was an idea that this was written at the beginning of time, in a way, either by the god himself or some sort of representative of him. And for a long time people thought that this was what was being talked about, but it was discovered, I think, in the European Renaissance, or it was worked out by detective work, that this wasn't from very ancient times, that this was from what we would call classical times, from a time of the Greek philosophy and the end of the Egyptian culture, in fact, and of the rise of the new religions of things like Christianity. So the Hermetica are written then. They're written at the end of the Egyptian culture. And for a long time, people kind of thought that discredited it, in a way. The fact that this character Thoth or Hermes Trismegistos in Hermetica was not as old as it made out. Instead of being, 6,000 years old, it's only 2,000 years old. But in a way, that doesn't discredit it. It makes it even more interesting, really. If you dispose of the fact as well, the other thing that gets in the way of this information is that people say not only was the authorship false, but it's got nothing to do with Egypt. As so often, people are always trying to write Egyptian philosophy out of the picture, really, and say it's just a pose. So they're trying to say, well, no, it's all Greek philosophy. But again, that was the view for a while. But recent research and many people look at it, it's so obviously full of Egyptian culture. Is certainly written, and all the sources come from Egypt. The context and the philosophy is thoroughly Egyptian, one way or another. The overall theology of one of the messages of the Hermetica is that God is kind of in everything, really. That one god, or their one particular deity like Amun or the sun god Ra, becomes many, the one and the many. This is the nature of one of the mysteries in the Hermetica is this thing of the one and the many, or the one principle that has become many things, has entered into all of nature. And you couldn't think of a more thoroughly Egyptian point of view that you would find in their own wisdom literature, their own instructions and philosophy. But for some reason, there's always been Egypt's fate to be kind of, for clever people to kind of write them out of the equation and say, no, it's a Greek idea, but it's more likely that the Greek philosophy, wonderful as it is and sophisticated and indispensable as it is, motivated, is drawing upon a wisdom tradition within Egypt, and this is a moment of a live debate, if you like, 2,000 years ago, and the Hermetica preserves a great deal of the magical ideas and philosophical ideas of ancient Egypt, as it's sort of the best bits, if you like, the highlights, put together at a time when the Egyptian culture was coming to a close, so people could see. Right? There were no native pharaohs anymore. They'd been invaded several times. The normal system, things like the scribal network, for instance, which required some sort of payment, the calendar, everything, all the different things we talked about, were all being changed and erased in a way. That's probably one of the main motivations for writing the Hermetica, to kind of summarize the best bits and preserve them for the future. But by irony, and this would have been done in the Greek language, and the Thoth name is translated into Hermes and it's called the Hermetica, the process of doing that kind of cancels the Egyptian connection, and part of the function, I suppose, of the modern magician is to restore that. It's to restore the magic as well. I mean, so the other thing about the Hermetica would be that if you read them, or whatever it is, about I think it's 23 or something different major articles or letters or dialogues, there's not a lot of magic in there. There is a very important piece of magic in there, but primarily it's the magic has been. People could look at it and say, well, you see the philosophers, they didn't really have much time for all this magical stuff. But they thought that was superstition. They're just into philosophy, into the kind of the theory, if you like, of this stuff, the meaning of life. But in fact, it's a little bit of a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, because the people who came along who liked these ideas very much, people, Christian philosophers such as Augustine and all the rest, they were only going to be passing forward some of this material if they could eradicate the magic from it. If they could purge the magic from it and just keep the theoretical bit, then that's what they did. You know, they were, that was quite important to them. But it became known that, I suppose, with things like the Nag Hammadi fragments, apparently, a place like Nag Hammadi, the people had their other copies, they've discovered other copies of the Hermetic fragments that where the magic hasn't been purged, you know, because it hasn't gone through this whole process. It was buried or whatever for such a long time. It's pristine state. So at the end of the Hermetica, you have a very interesting prayer to Thoth, you know, for inspiration, one way or another, and it ends with very typical piece of magic that would completely the same, in fact, as the stuff that you would find in this collection, also misnamed and misdirected, which is the Greek magical papyri, or really you should say the Greco-Egyptian Egyptian magical papyri, or just the Egyptian magical papyri in some ways. But by calling it the Greek magical papyri, in a sense, again, you're hiding the Egyptian connection. But whatever, there are prayers to Thoth in that collection, including the end part of a prayer that exists in this kind of supposedly non-magical collection called Magick. So Thoth is important then. I'm just scratching the surface really. If you listen to the other podcast as well, I talk a little bit about Thoth's birth, like his creation, the creation of Thoth, and his connection and resemblance to the god Set, and this trilogy of Set, Horus, and Thoth. I'll talk a little bit more about the underworld journey and all the rest, and how Thoth has this. The Thoth, essentially, the way of putting it, is a magical child in Western, modern, Crowleyan, whatever language. People talk about this thing called the magical child, the magical creation, which is the birth of certain entities, spiritual entities and sometimes God, but by a unusual route, not by the kind of familiar route of intercourse and between humans or gods and birth and growing up and all the rest. We're often talking about something that comes a different way. A magical child is the creation of a magical operation, one way or another. And Thoth is one of the primate samples of that, whose birth, I mean, it's not, this happens in other entities as well, but Thoth instantiates a very, very interesting mystery, which is the secret, if you like, a mystery and a secret that has kind of haunted the Western magical tradition ever since. I should say, personally, it was probably what originally got me interested in a lot of this stuff. Under the name Hermes. Hermes is this kind of ambiguous entity, if you like. Through that to the philosophy of Set, that this whole, I don't know, at the time I was very, very attracted to the archetype of Hermes, as I knew about it, but really what I knew, my version of Hermes was not so much the Greek version, although there was a little bit of that in it. It was really about the Thoth thing and this creation of things that are outside of the normal path of things. And as I explain in a little bit more detail, this creation of this moon child, you see they call it the moon child, a magical child. Another name is a moon child. Thoth is a moon god. Horus and Horus and Set together form a kind of a pair of twin moon deities in some versions of this whole myth system. The ebbing and flowing, or the waxing and waning of the moon, that's Horus and Set and whatever. And this ebb and flow, which is envisioned as some sort of battle between Horus and Set, eventually gives rise to a moon child, which is Thoth. And this is an incredibly important myth within the Egyptian tradition. Some people make it very central, not just an important myth, but a very central myth. But all right, we might not go that far. But certainly, from a Western mystery tradition, this triangle, Horus, Set, and Thoth, primarily the creation of Thoth as the moon god, via an act of sexual magic between Horus and Set, with assistance in all of that from the goddess Isis, So again, which happens in other circumstances as well, which we're going to go into at some point. In that whole dynamic, which, as I say, you can discuss this in various places, the whole secret of a kind of sexual mysticism, which is an unexplored and almost secret element of Egyptian culture itself, and it's probably one of the more controversial but also fascinating elements of Egyptian magic, of Western magic. Is probably the thing, this whole stuff about Hermes and sexuality, that attracts. It's probably one of the most interesting aspects of the whole of the magical tradition, if we admit it, is this secret, this supposed secret of sexual magic that comes in some way from the Egyptian tradition, but is extremely difficult to work it out, what that might involve, what the true mysteries of it are. We know it's connected with the moon. In Egypt, we know it's connected with the birth of the god Thoth from Set. It's not that Set is his father. Set is his mother and father. He's both. It's a magical creation. But that entire mystery and the many, many secrets of that are encoded within that myth, one way or another. It's too much to go into now, and plus maybe I don't need to explore all of the secrets in one go. So that's a little bit more about Thoth. We're in his month, and time to think about him and do some rituals for him and look at the moon, which is very, very special, and also think about the ancestors, your immediate ancestors, whether you call them your lower or whatever, the people, your immediate family, the people who passed on quite recently. Remember them in some way, even if you just bring them to mind and look at a photograph or just play a song that meant something to them, or visit their graves and tidy up as the Egyptians would have done. So I'll read you a little bit to finish from the Standard Adoration of Thoth. O gods who are in the sky, O gods who are on the earth, gods of the south, north, west and east, come and witness. Thoth appears glorious with his crown in Hermopolis, with the two lords, Horus and Set, guiding the common people, exultant in the great house of Geb, the earth god, on account of his efforts. Adore him, exalt him, praise him, felicitous Lord, the guide of the masses in their entirety. All you gods and goddesses, behold, praise Thoth this day, who founded your sanctuaries and devised the temple liturgy on the primal sunset island.